Unbelievable. Could this guy really think he was going to continue to steal from us? Turns out he also had plans to blackmail us if he's caught. Quite a first week on the job. Welcome to this episode of the CEO's Field Manual. I'm your host, Phil Kerper, Managing Director of Ringling Business Solutions. The title of today's episode, I was in a new job and one of my GMs was stealing us blind. Part 1. This is a situation I faced several years ago, and it promises to have some crazy twists and turns and very high drama. The story happens in China, but just to be clear, I've done business in China for decades. This unusual story is not specific to China. You could certainly end up with a general manager in the US or any country that you find was doing things they shouldn't be doing. I just want to make sure people don't consider this a reflection on one country or another. So let's jump right in. I was hired as the president of a U.S. manufacturing company. My first day happened to coincide with the major trade show they attended each year. It was awesome. I was able to show up on my first day as president, meet the team, meet customers, see our sales guys in action, work in an amazing booth. It was everything you could hope for on the first day as a president or leader in a new situation. Some background on China. The China company had been a licensee, and the uncle and owner retired. This happened several years before I joined the firm. The U.S. company bought out the uncle, and it was then a wholly owned subsidiary. They were building and selling products to Chinese specifications. The nephew was now the general manager. So the second day of the trade show, I had breakfast with the China general manager. We'll call him GM John. Have you ever gotten an odd feeling about someone right out of the gate? There was something off with John. He was uneasy, guarded, maybe evasive. It could be culture barriers, sometimes language barriers when you meet somebody. You're meeting your boss for the first time. I don't know, he could have had jet lag. There could have been a lot of things at play here, but there was no doubt there was something not quite right. So as I typically do, I asked a lot of open-ended questions. Tell me about the business. How can we help? What's your biggest opportunities? Stuff like that, just to see the types of things that he would come up with. Oddly, he kept landing on two topics. First, he just didn't have enough cash, and the U.S. companies didn't provide him with the amount of cash investment he really needed. Now, one standard rule, you fund your operations. Additional investments are for growth initiatives with a return on investment. Maybe he was not that seasoned, but this was an odd issue for him to land on. His second talking point was we, the U.S. leadership, didn't really understand what it took to be successful in China. He came back to this point several times, and he used an example that his sales team spent a lot of time wining and dining customers, all night out, spending cash on gifts. He was basically implying that he was buying favor with these customers, with these buyers. Now, my spidey senses were active for sure on this. As it turns out, just to say something else, I don't think he was actually doing this. I don't think he was bribing anybody at all. I think he was using that as a way to kind of push the U.S. executives back, farther away from his business, so he didn't get closer to what he was really doing, which was underhanded. A side note, in 1977, the Foreign Corruption Protections Act was passed. This is a law that has real teeth. It's an important read if you're doing business internationally. Basically, U.S. executives can't engage in favors, bribery, other things in foreign countries in order to secure business. And so by this GM John, drawing me into this, he was doing some things that you just don't do and putting a U.S. executive at risk. And that was another reason why my red flags were going off right out of the gate with this guy. I later learned that he was recording this, the breakfast, and all our conversations. You heard that right. He was secretly recording us. When it hit the fan later, he indeed tried to implicate me and anyone he could to save his own skin. This guy turned out to be a real skunk. Now, I was hired by this company to focus on the U.S. market and the Latin America markets, where the big opportunities were and where the large books of business were as well. So China was there, and I was responsible for it, but it wasn't my primary focus when I joined the firm. We got to our first monthly close, and GM John was late providing his financials. I quickly learned that this was a pattern. He was always late. He had basically trained the U.S. team to expect his financials a month or two later than they were due and to estimate the consolidated financial statements, waiting for him to get his numbers in. Well, this was not going to be acceptable with me, so I knew this guy was going to like me less and less as time went on. His annual audit, by the way, that's a whole nother topic. I won't cover it here, but there's some lessons there too as far as what someone might do to try to hide the ball. By this time, I had reviewed the past financial reports, and as you'd expect, China trends were, well, let's say not crazy, but not logical either. Here's a few examples. Gross margin percent of sales was not really aligning with logical things like product mix changes. It's a pretty basic product, and so there should be some alignment with, well, what do we ship, and what was the gross margins expected to be? There, of course, could be causes for this, but it just didn't look completely right. Fixed expenses were not behaving very fixed. They varied sometimes with sales, sometimes they just varied on their own. Again, many possible explanations for this, but noticeable. Operating income, the bottom line, it was low as a percentage of sales, but stable and consistent. At least GM John was not so dumb as to show losses and gain more suspicion. He was always making just a little bit of money. At this point, he was submitting his first month's result, and I was already pretty sure he was stealing. The question was, how big of a problem did we have? Now, when you have someone running a business or you're doing business with people in other countries, there can be some liberties taken with expenses. Not all countries are the same. My experience in Europe, for example, they're very disciplined. The UK particularly, very disciplined on what the expenses are, always right down the middle of the runway. Latin America also, believe it or not, is pretty disciplined from my experience. Colombia, for example, if you're a US company, you have a monthly independent audit there. And so things are usually managed pretty tightly. In the Pacific Rim, China, other places, it can be looser, and your executive might just be taking a few more liberties than what you're used to in the United States. But if you have a good partner, these things should never be material to your return as the principal of the business. So I'm back to the big question. How much money was involved here? GM John was making about $150,000 a year plus incentives, which was over market at that time. It was good comp. Was he padding the edges a little bit, or was he much greedier? Based on what I had seen in the numbers, I was concerned it was a much bigger problem than just a little bit of expense padding. At this point, I didn't want to ask him too many questions either and alert him to my suspicions. I needed to start thinking now about future steps. Where were we going with this, and how are we going to get to the bottom? It was time to sit down with our owner and the VP of Finance of our parent company. Our chairman was a very smart, talented guy. So I sat down with him, the VP of Finance, went over my concerns, and we set a direction for going forward. Following that meeting, our VP of Finance and I were scheduling a visit for China, and we're going there for an announced business review so we can see firsthand what was going on. Let's quickly go through a couple of takeaways. When your spidey senses are active, listen. Your instincts are extremely valuable. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. Next, look at trends rather than just one set of results. I went back over 2 years and put together monthly trends of the financials out of China. I had to see what was happening over time versus just a couple of shots. If I would have just looked at a couple of months or what he submitted that month, I wasn't going to get that much information. But a couple of years got me what I needed. Takes work, but it's well worth it. And finally, when I got to the point of having to move forward on the problem, it was a strategic decision and I needed to know where I was going. So, on big issues, know your future moves before making the next one. You can think on your feet, make quick decisions on tactical stuff, but when it comes to larger issues and strategic issues, it's helpful to take a step back, really think about where you're going, and then what are the next steps to make it in context of the future. Stay tuned to the next episode of the CEO's Field Manual when I visit China to gauge the extent of the problem without tipping my hand. The end of this story is filled with drama, chaos, and wild turns that are both amazing and instructive. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Please subscribe and we'll see you at a future video.